Good morning. My name is Mark Baldessari, and I'm President and CEO of and Director of the PPIC Statewide Survey at the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to our virtual program today featuring the findings from the latest PPIC Statewide Survey on Californians and their government. This survey was conducted with funding from the R.J. and Francis F. Miller Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, and the PPIC Donor Circle. We want to thank them for their support, which made this work possible. We'd also like to thank the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle for their support of this virtual events program. PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or any local, state, or federal legislation, nor does it endorse, support, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. For today's program, my colleague Rachel Lawler will walk you through some of the key findings from the survey. And after her presentation, I will share some of my takeaways, and then we'll answer some audience questions. If you have a question, and I hope you do, and some people have already sent in questions today, please send an email to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We would appreciate if you would include your name and organization along with your question. And now I would like to introduce Rachel Lawler, who is a research associate at PPIC and was the project manager for this survey. Rachel, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Mark, and thank you all for joining us today and for your interest in this work. Just give me a moment to start sharing my screen with you. All right, so before we begin today, I would just like to acknowledge my co-authors of this report, which obviously includes Mark, as well as Dean Bonner and Alyssa Dykeman. And as Mark mentioned, this survey is part of our Californians and Their Government series, which has covered numerous state and national issues since 1999. And for those of you who might be joining us for the first time and are unfamiliar with the PPIC statewide survey, its mission is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions, which we hope will then be used to inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. The PPIC survey covers public perceptions, attitudes, and policy preferences, as well as ballot choices on both state and national races. Since the start of the survey, PPIC has provided a voice for over 360,000 Californians on more than 180 general, issue-specific, and regional surveys. This particular survey was conducted from October 9th through 18th using telephone interviews, 75% of which were conducted on cell phones and 25% of which were conducted on landlines. The interviews were conducted in either English or Spanish according to the respondents' preferences, and our sample includes over 1,700 California adults and 1,185 of those respondents who we have identified as likely voters. The margin of error is 3.5% for all adults and 4.3% for likely voters. In the full report, which you can find on the PPIC website, we have two main sections. The first section focuses on the November 2020 election, which is now less than 2 weeks away, and the second section looks at state and national issues. To start this presentation off today, we're going to be looking at some findings that will help us set the stage for Election Day. To start off, we know that concerns about certain issues can have an impact on voter decisions about what candidates they vote for and what ballot measures they support or oppose. So with that in mind, we're going to look first at what Californians say is the top issue facing our state today. This was an open-ended question, and perhaps unsurprisingly, 1 in 5 adults say that COVID-19 is the most important issue, followed by 16% who think jobs and the economy is tops. It's worth mentioning that these were both the top 2 issues when we last asked this question in May. Other issues that had fewer mentions this month include concerns about the environment at 7%, followed by homelessness, housing costs and availability, and the state budget, all at 6%. The recent wildfires across the state means that that issue is top of mind for 5% of Californians. COVID-19 is the top issue for Democrats, while Republicans and independents are most concerned about jobs and the economy. The coronavirus is also cited as the most important issue across all the major regions, as well as across demographic groups. Turning now to approval ratings for our state elected officials. Governor Newsom's approval rating is 58% among all adults and 57% among likely voters. Approval is similar to last month, but it has dropped very slightly from the record high ratings we saw in May, when 65% of adults and 64% of likely voters approved. At 83%, Democrats are far more likely than independents at 50%, and Republicans at 18% to say they approve. And today, half or more across the state's regions, as well as all demographic groups, approve of the governor. In terms of the California legislature, 51% of adults and 45% of likely voters approve, and approval ratings were similar last month. Today, 64% of Democrats approve compared to 42% of independents and only 15% of Republicans. And about half or more across regions approve of the legislature. Among racial ethnic groups, majorities of Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans approved, compared to 42% of whites, and approval of the legislature declines as age increases. And moving on now to approval ratings for federal elected officials. When it comes to President Trump, as he faces re-election in less than 2 weeks, his approval rating in California is 35% among all adults and 34% among likely voters. His approval has remained fairly consistent since he took office, and was similar both at the start of 2020 and in September of last year. More than 8 in 10 Republicans approve of the president, compared to 1/3 of independents and fewer than 1 in 10 Democrats. Across regions, Inland Empire residents are the most likely to approve of the president, and among racial ethnic groups, whites and Latinos are the most likely to approve. And looking now at Congress, 36% of adults and 26% of likely voters approve of the way Congress is handling its job, and approval was similar in September and at this time last year. About 3 in 10 or fewer across partisan groups approve, with the exception of Central Valley residents, where approval is 41%, fewer than 4 in 10 across the major regions of the state say that they approve. And finally, 52% of Latinos say they approve of the job that Congress is doing, compared to fewer than 4 in 10 in other racial ethnic groups. And turning now to the overall outlook for the state and for the nation, which can tell us a lot about the mood heading into this election. We find that in general, Californians are much more likely to think things are going in the right direction in California than they are to think that things are going in the right direction in the United States as a whole. 55% of adults and half of likely voters think things in California are generally going in the right direction, versus only 1/3 of adults and 1/4 of likely voters who think the United States is going in the right direction. There are large differences across partisan groups, with an overwhelming majority of Democrats thinking things in the state are going in the right direction, and a majority of Republicans thinking it is going in the wrong direction. Conversely, nearly half of Republicans think that the country is going in the right direction, while 81% of Democrats think it is going in the wrong direction. Independents are about twice as likely to think California is going in the right direction than they are to think that the United States is going in the right direction. Finally, about half or more across the state's major regions and across all demographic groups think California is going in the right direction, while majorities across regions and demographic groups say the United States is going in the wrong direction. Now we're going to get into what I'm sure everyone has been waiting for, some findings about the November 3rd election. This election, particularly the presidential race, has been billed by many as possibly the most consequential election in our lifetime. And as a result, voter enthusiasm is high. 72% of likely voters in California say they are more enthusiastic than usual about voting in the presidential race. And this is actually a record high in PPIC surveys, and it's 23 percentage points higher than voter enthusiasm was 1 month prior to the 2016 election. And this enthusiasm is not limited to only one party. More than 7 in 10 Democrats and Republicans and about 6 in 10 independents are more enthusiastic than usual. And all of these partisan groups have seen double-digit increases in enthusiasm from October 2016. We also find that more than 6 in 10 across regions and all demographic groups say they are more enthusiastic. And with all registered voters in the state receiving a mail ballot this year, this enthusiasm is very apparent in the fact that over 4 million Californians have already voted. And with only 12 days to go before the general election, the Democratic ticket of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris has a 26-point lead over the Republican ticket of Donald Trump and Mike Pence among likely voters in California. 58% of likely voters said they would vote the Biden-Harris ticket, and 32% say that they would vote for the Trump-Pence ticket. And this breakdown of vote share has been relatively unchanged from May. 5% of likely voters are supporting either the Libertarian ticket of Jorgensen and Cohen or the Green Party ticket of Hawkins and Walker. And at this point, very few likely voters are undecided about which ticket they will support. Partisans are perhaps unsurprisingly overwhelmingly supporting their party's candidate, while Biden leads among independents 47 to 35%. He also leads by wide margins in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles, and by narrower margins in the Inland Empire and Orange San Diego, while Trump holds a slight lead of 44% to 38% in the Central Valley. Majorities among racial ethnic groups and across age and income groups support Biden, and women are much more likely than men to support the Democratic ticket. And whether or not the balance of power will change in the US Congress is a major subplot in the 2020 election. And if the election were today, 58% of likely voters say that they would vote for or lean toward the Democratic candidate, while 37% say they would vote for or lean towards the Republican candidate. And similar to their choice for president, partisans overwhelmingly support their own party. Independents here are more divided, with 46% supporting the Democratic candidate and 43% supporting the Republican candidate. The Democratic candidate is preferred by large margins in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles, and narrower margins in Orange San Diego. Likely voters in the Inland Empire region are divided, while a slim majority in the Central Valley prefer the Republican candidate. Democratic candidates are preferred by a 27-point margin in districts that are currently held by Democratic representatives, while Republican candidates are preferred by a 10-point margin in districts that are currently held by Republican representatives. And according to the Cook Political Report, there are 8 House districts in California that are competitive in the upcoming election. And in those districts, likely voters are divided, with 49% supporting the Democratic candidate and 47% supporting the Republican candidate. Besides the federal, state, and local races, California voters will be voting on 12 state propositions in the upcoming election. And we read the ballot language and asked likely voters how they will vote on 2 of the 12 propositions. The first, Proposition 15, changes the tax assessment of commercial and industrial properties so that it is based on current market value instead of original purchase price. The revenue raised from this measure would go to local governments and schools. And likely voters are divided on this proposition, as 49% would vote yes, 45% would vote no, and 6% are undecided. And the gap between the yes and no votes was wider when we asked this question last month. It was at 11 percentage points when 51% said they would vote yes, 40% no, and 9% were undecided. The second measure that we asked about is Proposition 16, which repeals the state's ban on affirmative action. And on this measure, 37% of likely voters would vote yes, 50% no, and 12% are undecided. In September, we also asked about Proposition 16, and support was lower and more were undecided. 31% then would vote yes, compared to 47% no, and 22% were unsure. And at that time, the gap between yes and no was 16 points. So looking more closely at Proposition 15, Democratic likely voters overwhelmingly support the measure, while 3 and 4 Republicans are voting no. Independents are more divided, but a slight majority are voting no. When we look at the breakdown by region, half or more support Prop 15 in Los Angeles, Orange, San Diego, and the San Francisco Bay Area, while a majority in the Central Valley are opposed. Inland Empire residents are split, with 48% voting yes and 48% voting no. The measure is amending part of the original 1978 Proposition 13, and we see that reflected here in renters being far more likely than homeowners to say they would vote yes. Likely voters between the ages of 18 and 44 are also more likely to vote yes than are voters age 45 and older. And diving deeper into Prop 16, about 6 in 10 Democratic likely voters would vote yes, while solid majorities of Republicans and independents would vote no. And when we look at the vote breakdown among racial ethnic groups, 53% of whites and 48% of Latinos would vote no, while 51% in other racial ethnic groups would vote yes. And lastly, fewer than half of likely voters across regions and across the other remaining demographic groups would vote yes. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, last month, President Trump nominated Judge Amy Coney Barrett to fill the US Supreme Court vacancy left by the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And with the Judiciary Committee recently concluding confirmation hearings for Judge Barrett and a Senate vote set for Monday, we asked Californians whether they think the Senate should confirm her to the Supreme Court or not. And we found that 41% of adults believe the Senate should confirm her, and 47% do not think that she should be confirmed to the court. 12% have either not heard enough information to have an opinion or don't know. Opinions on this issue break largely along party lines, as an overwhelming majority of Democrats say she should not be confirmed, while an overwhelming majority of Republicans think that she should be. Independents, on the other hand, are closely split. A majority in Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area do not think Judge Barrett should be confirmed, while 55% of Central Valley residents do. And those in the Inland Empire and Orange, San Diego are divided. And interestingly, at 52%, a slim majority of women do not think the Senate should confirm her, while men are divided. And with COVID-19 being the most important issue facing the state, we are going to finish up by taking a look at Californians' attitudes toward getting a COVID-19 vaccine, if one were available today. And as many of you are probably aware, efforts to develop and test COVID-19 vaccines are currently underway. And there is a possibility that one or more vaccines will be available by the end of the year. So today, 57% of adults would definitely or probably get a vaccine to prevent COVID-19 if it were available. Conversely, 4 in 10 say they would definitely or probably not get vaccinated at this time. There is partisan agreement on this question, as half or more across partisan groups say they would get the vaccine. However, we did see stark differences among racial ethnic groups, where we find 70% of Asian Americans saying that they will definitely or probably get the vaccine, compared to 62% of whites, 54% of Latinos, and 29% of African Americans. We also find that men are much more likely than women, and Californians age 55 and older are more likely than younger Californians under 55 to say that they would definitely or probably get a COVID-19 vaccine. Now, in addition to all the findings that I've shared today, I wanted to highlight some other key areas and findings that were covered by this survey and that are in the full report, but that we did not cover in this webinar. First, when it comes to approval of California's congressional leaders, 48% of adults and 46% of likely voters approve of the way Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, is handling her job. For House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, 35% of adults and 31% of likely voters approve of the way that he is handling his job. When we asked likely voters about their views on California's initiative process, 12% are very satisfied with the process, 48% are somewhat satisfied, and 32% are not satisfied. In addition, 63% of likely voters say special interests have a lot of control over the initiative process. And further, 55% of likely voters agree that there are too many propositions on the ballot, and 82% agree that ballot wording for initiatives is often confusing and complicated. Next, we asked respondents whether they think California is divided into the economic groups of the haves and the have-nots, and 64% believe it is divided this way, while 32% believe it is not. When we asked which of the two groups they fell into, 44% said the haves, 43% said the have-nots, and 10% said neither. And for this question, we found majorities of whites and Asian Americans, as well as those earning $80,000 or more annually, place themselves into the haves category, while majorities of African Americans, Latinos, and those earning less than $80,000 annually place themselves in the have-nots category. With Judge Barrett's Supreme Court nomination has resurfaced some questions about whether the Roe versus Wade decision could be overturned. And today we find 70% of Californians do not want the decision overturned, and majorities across parties are in agreement that the decision should not be overturned. Further, in November, the Supreme Court will hear arguments on whether the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, is constitutional in whole or in part. And today, 60% of Californians have a generally favorable view of the law, while 34% have an unfavorable opinion of it. And lastly, with the election only days away, 47% of adults hold a favorable view of the Democratic Party, while 35% hold a favorable view of the Republican Party. And with fewer than half holding favorable views of either major party, 57% of Californians think that the parties do such a poor job representing the American people that a third major party is needed. And that's similar to what we observed in 2016 before the last presidential election. So at this point, that concludes the presentation slides, but I would like to remind everyone in the audience to submit any questions or comments to the email address on your screen. That's ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And please remember to include your name as well as the organization that you are with. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it back over to Mark.
Thank you, Rachel. That was a very complete and comprehensive review of the survey findings. Really appreciate it. And all the leadership you provided in managing this important, our final for 2020 election survey. So thanks very much. And we'll get to questions in just a moment. I just wanted to make a few brief comments to I think reinforce a number of the findings, which importance of the findings, which Rachel already has pointed to earlier. I would want for those of you who go back and look at the survey to take a look at that list of issues which people describe as the most important issues facing people in California today, because it is such a remarkable list, because it's just been such an unprecedented year. We have COVID on the mentioned as the #1 issue. All of us know out of nowhere came COVID earlier this year. We have jobs in the economy as a result of the COVID crisis. But then there are a number of other issues which didn't quite get to 10%, but give you a sense of the scope of the crisis that California and the state and the nation are facing today. Global warming and environment mentioned, which, typically global warming has had very low mentions, but now it's among the top mentions because recently we have just been facing a series of wildfires again this year after having faced wildfires last year and 2 years ago. And that's really raised the profile of global warming as well as wildfires in California. We have homelessness and we have housing costs and availability. These were two issues that we saw at the beginning of the year as really top tier issues in California. Homelessness, which has just been so present and so obvious lately in California, and ongoing concerns about the cost and availability of housing and what implications that has for the future of the state and for people who are making decisions about whether they want to be in California in the long term. And then last but not least, coming up this month to be among the top issues, something we haven't seen for a while, but probably we're going to be seeing it in future surveys, and that's the state budget and spending. We're not at the point yet because there's so much uncertainty about what the federal relief package will look like and when it will come and what will be available and what this will mean for the state budget. But people are beginning to think about the fact that with the economy being where it is, with the level of demands that the COVID crisis is placing on the health system and more broadly on the quality of life in California, that the state budget, once again, surfacing as an issue and as something we'll be looking for in future surveys. I do want to point out just one other thing that I think is really important context for this election, and that is that that record level of enthusiasm that we picked up on in this survey in terms of voting for president, with nearly 3 out of 4, and really across political parties, saying that they're more enthusiastic than usual about voting. And keeping in mind that everybody's going to be getting a ballot in the mail who's voting this time, and have that option to send that in. And we're seeing from our survey that a lot of people are already sent in their surveys because their mail ballots, because they're finding out that they want to make sure that those ballots are counted. And so we are anticipating, based on what we're seeing in the survey, a very strong turnout this year, which will have implications for this for everything that's on the ballot, not just for president, but first and foremost, the fact that people are so focused on the presidential election this year is something that we all need to keep in mind. My guess is that there will be many people who are on our webcast this morning who will be watching the debate tonight, even though you've made up your mind and you've probably already, some of you sent in your ballots, you're going to be wanting to watch that debate because, again, it's indicative of how much interest there is in this presidential election this year. Rachel mentioned the fact that we have 12 state propositions on the ballot in this unusual year where there is so much attention to the presidential election, where there is such an incredible list of issues which people describe as the issues most important to the people facing California. As people make their decisions about those 12 propositions, they're going to be going down that list of propositions, and they're going to be thinking about what's going to solve the problems that we're having during this crisis. What do we need to go forward? And as a voter, what can I do to contribute to more positive outcomes in terms of how I vote on this measure? Do I vote yes or do I vote no? Is it the right time to make these changes. Is this going to be a change for the better? And as always with state propositions and voters' decisions about them, the burden of proof is always on the yes side. The people who put this on the ballot to explain to the voters why it is that that the measure that's placed on the ballot is going to lead to a better future, better California. So the campaigns, the opponents and the proponents, both of them will be making their closing arguments for the next few weeks, keeping in mind that many people have already voted. So those closing arguments will go towards those who have yet to fill out their ballot and send it in. Last and not least, I want to point out something that Rachel mentioned in her closing remarks, and that is the racial disparities that we're seeing today and the income disparities in the COVID crisis, and in particular in our survey pointing out the level of resistance we're seeing today to the uptake of vaccines when vaccines are available. A quarter of people saying that they will definitely take that vaccine, and others with some degree of uncertainty, and particularly noteworthy among some of the groups that have been most heavily impacted, African Americans and Latinos in particular, some of the greatest resistance in terms of taking that vaccine. And that's very important for our public health officials to really begin to focus on that as we prepare for the moment when vaccines do become available, that not everyone is going to be ready and fully aware of the importance of taking the vaccine as we try to reduce the impacts of COVID-19 in the state. And also, as we think ahead to past the election to 2021, those large numbers of people in California who describe themselves as among the economic have-nots, the implications that COVID-19 crisis has had on the have-nots and the racial disparities that are present, as well as the income disparities in those descriptions of people as not having the feeling like they don't have what others have in California and what they need to have a high quality of life in California today. And those are going to be issues that are going to be front and center after the election, whatever the outcomes are, and as we look to 2021. So those are my brief comments, and just wanted to start the Q&A by, again, a reminder to all of you, please submit any questions you have. And let me mention a question that came in from the audience, and that was that some speculate about a record Democratic voter turnout in California. What do you think the prospects are for that? And if there will be a record turnout, is that at the expense of no party preference or Republican voters? So Rachel, any thoughts about the voter turnout, and is it going to be a record Democratic voter turnout?
I would say it is going to be a record Democratic voter turnout, but not just a record Democratic voter turnout. I think it will be the same case for Republicans and independents or no party preference voters, purely based on the fact of the high levels of enthusiasm that we're seeing. Over 7 in 10 Democrats and Republicans more enthusiastic to vote for president this year, as well as 60% of no party preference voters. So I think it's going to be record turnout across the board. Also because, like you mentioned, Mark, that all registered voters got a ballot this year. So I think we're going to see possibly some people that may have not voted in a very long time voting in this election.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Another question from the audience, and this is the kind of question we ask each other on the survey team very often. Why did we do things a certain way? But why does the survey break out environment at 7% from wildfires at 5%? Aren't these related issues having to do with climate change?
Well, when I look through the verbatim responses to this question, we have to take obviously what the respondent is giving us. So for example, a lot of responses that will go into the environment category or climate change category are people that are specifically saying climate change, global warming, things along those lines. Whereas with the wildfires, it's typically just people saying the fires in my region or the wildfires without mentioning anything about it being because of climate change. So we can't assume, we have to, we have to be accurate in how we code things. So we don't want to assume that people who mention fires are relating that to climate change. They may be, but if they don't give us that information, we cannot group them together.
Yeah, totally. And that is the first question that we ask in the survey, and it's one that we've asked for many years, so we can compare that over time. And then the people who are on the phone with our interviewees are writing down their responses, and then we take those responses verbatim, word for word, and combine them into categories. And 7% specifically mentioned things like environment, global warming, different environmental issues, and 5% specifically wildfires. If we put those two numbers together, it does give us a sense that we're in a very different place today in California than we were a few years ago in terms of the level of attention that people have towards wildfires and climate change today. Yeah. Okay, so what explains why enthusiasm for voting in the presidential election is so high this year? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think we've touched on it a little bit so far. So just, I think I mentioned it in the presentation, in a lot of media outlets, and people are kind of billing this election as the most important, most consequential election that we'll see in our lifetime. And I think even the candidates on both sides are trying to hammer this point home with their voters to get them to turn out on election day or mail their ballot in. So I think that's one element of it. Again, also with all California registered voters getting mailed a ballot, I think that's, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think that's another element. And then I think there also could be the fact that we have the first woman of color on the ballot as a vice presidential nominee this year. I think that is another factor that might be driving some of that enthusiasm, particularly on the Democratic side.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think for all the reasons that you mentioned, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or no party preference, this seems like the biggest election in a lifetime. The amount of media attention, so both social media and national media and state media, it's just incredible. There was a question about the partisans, about the right direction, wrong direction questions, which I thought were very telling, and that people were more divided about how they thought about the direction of the state than they, and more negative than they were about how they thought about the direction of the nation. A question about, that obviously there's a partisan split between Democrats and Republicans. But how did independents feel about it? Why is it that independents are more likely to say California is going in the right direction than to say that the U.S. is? So I'll answer that one, and just say that if you look at the no party preference voters in California, they tend to have higher approval of the governor and the legislature than they do of the president and Congress. So always the right direction, wrong direction questions are a combination of how people are feeling about the political climate as well as the economic climate. And for independents, they tend to lean more Democratic in California, and they tend to have more favorable things to say about the Democratic governor and legislature and how they're doing right now. So I think as our last question, there is a question about anything in particular that surprised you about the survey findings. So Rachel, I'll ask that for you.
Sure. There were a couple things, definitely the voter enthusiasm across parties, but we've talked about that a little bit already. So I would say another finding that was surprising to me, even though we saw similar results in our September survey, is the vote outcome on Prop 16. It's a bit surprising to me given California's general political leanings. I do think that there is a bit of vagueness in the ballot language in terms of exactly how the attributes like race, sex, color, ethnicity, national origin, about how those things will actually be considered by the state if this were to pass. And the language, if you read it, it actually says that the effects of the measure depend on future choices of state and local governments. So they're highly uncertain. So I think that uncertainty combined with the kind of possibly confusing language maybe leading to some of the outcome that we're seeing, but I definitely did find it a bit surprising.
Yeah. And I'll just make one comment about surprising in reference to the fact that the Senate Judiciary vote on the Supreme Court nominee today and the vote of the full Senate coming up next week, that we saw a very strong partisan divide in terms of the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett. That part wasn't surprising, but the fact that we saw 7 out of 10 saying that they did not want the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade, and that included majorities across political parties. Slimmer majority among Republicans, 53%, 89% of Democrats, 77% of independents. That was, that was one that I didn't expect, since there's been so much partisanship around the Supreme Court nominee, not on overturning Roe v. Wade as much. And that we saw, I think from the standpoint of the history of the survey, one of the strongest readings on the Affordable Care Act that we have seen in its history, with 60% of Californians and 61% of likely voters saying they have a favorable opinion. And that is, those are very high ratings at a time when the Supreme Court will be making first of maybe, and maybe there'll be other decisions later on, but in a year in which the state has faced an unprecedented COVID crisis, which has put all kinds of pressures on health and public health, we're seeing very strong support for the ACA in California. So that will be our questions for today. I want to once again thank everybody for joining us. I want a big thank you to Rachel for the presentation today, as well as managing the current survey, for the funders who make this survey possible, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. If you pre-registered for this event, later today you'll receive a survey. We hope you'll fill out that survey and take a couple of minutes and let us know how we did. Please have a safe and wonderful afternoon. Thank you.